In a world where royal duties often feel rehearsed and distant from everyday struggles, sometimes reality breaks through the carefully orchestrated schedule with the raw power of human emotion. On what seemed like another routine royal engagement, Queen Camilla found herself face to face with the heart-wrenching truth of what it means to serve and protect in modern Britain. A single 999 call would transform her understanding of duty, compassion, and the invisible threads that connect us all in our most desperate moments. What she heard that day would stay with her forever, reminding us all that behind every emergency call is a human story waiting to unfold. And sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete facade of the Metropolitan Police headquarters as Queen Camilla's convoy pulled through the security gates. The familiar routine of royal protection officers checking and double-checking arrangements played out in the background, but today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the weight of recent events that had shaken the nation, or maybe it was simply the autumn air that carried with it a sense of change. Queen Camilla stepped from her vehicle, her practiced smile greeting the assembled officials who had gathered to welcome her. The Commissioner of Police, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled back severely, extended her hand in greeting. Behind her stood a line of officers, their uniforms crisp and their expressions respectful but curious. This wasn't just another ceremonial visit. The Queen Consort had specifically requested to see the operational heart of the police service, to understand how the men and women in blue responded to the daily crises that most people only heard about on the evening news. As they walked through the corridors lined with photographs of fallen officers and commendations for bravery, Queen Camilla found herself studying the faces in the pictures. Each one told a story of sacrifice, of split-second decisions made in the darkness of night or the chaos of emergency. The Commissioner spoke in measured tones about response times, about the challenges of modern policing, about the technology that had revolutionized how they served the public. But Queen Camilla's attention was drawn to the quieter details, the family photographs on desks, the coffee-stained notebooks filled with careful handwriting, the tired eyes of officers finishing night shifts. The tour progressed through various departments, each one revealing another layer of the complex machinery that kept London safe. In the forensics lab, she watched as technicians processed evidence with the patience of archaeologists. In the traffic control room, screens flickered with live feeds from across the capital, showing the constant flow of humanity going about their daily lives. But it was when they reached the emergency response center that something shifted in the atmosphere. The room buzzed with quiet intensity. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens glowing with maps, incident reports, and constantly updating information. Operators sat with headsets, their voices calm and professional as they handled call after call. The Commissioner explained how every 999 call that came into the Metropolitan Police area was processed here, how trained operators made split-second decisions about resource allocation and response priority. Queen Camilla moved between the workstations, observing the operators at work. She noticed how they maintained their composure while dealing with situations that would leave most people shaken. A domestic disturbance in South London, a traffic accident on the North Circular, a burglary in progress in Westminster. Each call represented someone's worst day, someone's moment of desperate need for help. One operator, a young woman with kind eyes and greying temples, looked up as Queen Camilla approached. Her name badge read Sarah Mitchell, and she had been with the service for 15 years. Sarah explained how the system worked, how calls were categorized and prioritized, how they worked to get the right help to the right place as quickly as possible. But beneath the professional explanation, Queen Camilla sensed something deeper. A weariness that spoke of years spent absorbing other people's tragedies, of carrying the weight of countless emergency calls. The Commissioner suggested they listen to a recorded call to demonstrate the professionalism of the operators, something routine that would show the Queen Consort how the system functioned. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. There were hundreds of calls logged every day, most of them following predictable patterns. Road traffic accidents, minor disputes, reports of suspicious activity. But as she scrolled through the recent calls, one entry made her pause. It had come in the previous evening, logged at 8:47 p.m. The initial classification was welfare check, but Sarah remembered this one. She remembered it because it had stayed with her long after her shift ended, following her home and keeping her awake. The caller had been an elderly man, his voice shaky with fear and confusion. What had started as a routine welfare check had quickly become something much more complex and heartbreaking. Sarah looked up at Queen Camilla and the assembled officials. She could play one of the standard calls, something clean and straightforward that would demonstrate the efficiency of the system, but something in the Queen Consort's eyes, a genuine interest that went beyond polite royal duty, made her reconsider. This was a chance to show the real work they did, the human stories behind the statistics. With a slight nod to the commissioner, Sarah selected the call from the previous evening. The audio quality was clear, the recording system capturing every nuance of the conversation. As she prepared to play it, Sarah found herself hoping that this glimpse into their world would help people understand what they dealt with every day. The invisible crisis that played out in homes across London while most people slept safely in their beds. The room fell quiet except for the ambient hum of computers and the distant sound of radio chatter from other departments. Queen Camilla leaned forward slightly, her attention fully focused on what she was about to hear. Around her, the tour group settled into respectful silence, unaware that they were about to witness something that would transform a routine royal visit into a profound moment of human connection. Sarah's finger hovered over the play button. In that instant before the call began, she found herself thinking about the man on the other end of the line, wondering how he was doing today, hoping that the help they had sent had arrived in time. These thoughts followed every call she handled, a collection of strangers whose voices she would remember long after they had moved on with their lives. The recording began with the familiar electronic beep that marked the start of a 199 call, followed by the calm, professional voice of the emergency operator, asking which service was required. But what followed would challenge everything Queen Camilla thought she knew about the daily struggles faced by ordinary people in modern Britain. The elderly man's voice trembled as he explained his situation. He was calling from his flat in East London, alone and frightened. His wife of 53 years had been taken to hospital 3 days earlier, and he hadn't heard anything since. He didn't know how to cook, didn't understand the bills that kept arriving, couldn't figure out how to work the washing machine. He had been eating nothing but biscuits for 2 days because he was afraid to leave the flat in case the hospital called. But it wasn't just the practical difficulties that made this call so powerful. It was the raw loneliness in his voice, the way he apologized repeatedly for bothering them, the quiet desperation of someone who had nowhere else to turn. He explained that his children lived abroad, that his neighbors barely spoke to him, that his wife had always handled everything. Without her, he was lost in a world that had become suddenly unfamiliar and threatening. As the call continued, Queen Camilla felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about police work or emergency services. This was about the fabric of society, about how people could become isolated even in a city of millions, about the invisible struggles that played out behind closed doors every day. The man's voice carried the weight of a generation that had lived through war and hardship. People who had built the modern world but now found themselves strangers in it. The operator handling the call demonstrated exactly why Sarah had wanted Queen Camilla to hear it. Rather than simply dispatching officers to check on the caller, she stayed on the line, talking him through his immediate concerns. She helped him understand that it was okay to call the hospital for an update about his wife, gave him the number for local support services, and arranged for a community police officer to visit him the next day, not as law enforcement, but as a connection to help. The call lasted nearly 30 minutes. Far longer than the typical emergency response, but the operator never showed impatience or tried to rush the conversation. She understood that for this man, calling 1999 represented the last resort, the final attempt to reach out for help in a world that seemed to have forgotten he existed. Her kindness and professionalism transformed what could have been a brief welfare check into a lifeline for someone who desperately needed to know that somebody cared. When the recording ended, the emergency response center remained silent for several long moments. Queen Camilla stood motionless, her hands clasped in front of her, processing what she had just heard. Around her, the assembled officials waited respectfully, perhaps sensing that something significant had just occurred. Finally, Queen Camilla spoke, her voice quieter than it had been during the earlier parts of the tour. She asked about the man, whether they had followed up, whether he had received the help he needed. Sarah explained that the community officer had indeed visited, connecting the man with local services and helping him establish contact with the hospital where his wife was recovering. It was a good outcome, but Sarah knew that there were dozens of similar calls every week. People falling through the gaps in a society that moved too fast to notice individual suffering. The commissioner began to explain the protocols for welfare checks and community policing initiatives, but Queen Camilla raised her hand gently to pause the technical discussion. She wanted to know more about the operators themselves, about how they processed these deeply personal encounters, about the emotional toll of being the voice on the other end of someone's worst moment. Sarah and her colleagues began to open up about their work in ways that went beyond the usual briefing materials. They talked about the calls that stayed with them, about the responsibility they felt to every person who reached out for help, about the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference in someone's life. But they also spoke honestly about the challenges, about the cases where they couldn't provide the help that was needed, about the systemic problems that made their job harder every year. As the conversation deepened, Queen Camilla found herself seeing the police service through entirely new eyes. This wasn't just about crime and punishment, about law and order in the traditional sense. This was about people taking care of people, about public servants who had dedicated their careers to being there when everything else fell apart. The 1999 call from the lonely widower had revealed something profound about the hidden connections that held society together, about the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. The impact of hearing that 999 call continued to resonate through Queen Camilla as the tour moved into its second phase. The commissioner had planned to show her the new training facilities and discuss modernization initiatives, but the Queen Consort found herself drawn back to the human stories behind the statistics. She asked if she could meet some of the community officers who followed up on calls, like the one she had just heard, wanting to understand how they bridged the gap between emergency response and ongoing support. In a small conference room lined with community policing awards and local partnership certificates, Queen Camilla sat across from PC James Morrison, the officer who had visited the elderly caller the day after his desperate phone call. James was in his early 40s, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who had learned to find moments of joy even in difficult circumstances. He had been doing community policing for 12 years, and his patch included some of the most challenging housing estates in East London. James described his visit to Harold Thompson, the 78-year-old man who had made the call. He had found Harold in his cramped council flat, surrounded by unopened letters and empty biscuit packages, clearly overwhelmed by circumstances that had spiraled beyond his ability to cope. Harold's wife, Margaret, had been his anchor for more than 5 decades, handling everything from finances to social connections. Without her, he was like a ship without navigation, drifting in unfamiliar waters. But what struck James most wasn't Harold's practical difficulties, though those were real enough. It was the man's profound isolation, the way he flinched when James knocked on the door, as if unexpected visitors could only bring bad news. Harold had apologized repeatedly for calling 999, convinced that he was wasting resources that should be reserved for real emergencies. He couldn't understand that his situation was exactly the kind of crisis that community policing was designed to address. James had spent 3 hours with Harold that morning, not because procedure required it, but because the human connection was clearly what the old man needed most. They had called the hospital together to check on Margaret's condition, discovering that she was recovering well from her surgery but would need several more days of treatment. James had helped Harold understand the medical terminology, translating the clinical updates into language that made sense to someone from a generation that was often intimidated by modern healthcare bureaucracy. More importantly, James had helped Harold begin to rebuild the support network that had disappeared when Margaret was hospitalized. They contacted Harold's sister in Scotland, whom he hadn't spoken to in months because he didn't want to bother anyone with his problems. They arranged for a local volunteer service to check on him daily and help with shopping and meal preparation. James connected him with a seniors group that met at the community centre, people who understood the challenges of aging in a rapidly changing world. Queen Camilla listened to these details with growing fascination. This was policing as social work, law enforcement as community care, public service at its most fundamental level. James explained that calls like Harold's were increasingly common, reflecting broader social changes that had left many elderly people isolated and vulnerable. Traditional family structures had dispersed across the globe. Neighborhoods had become collections of strangers rather than communities, and the informal support systems that previous generations had taken for granted had largely disappeared. The conversation was interrupted when James's radio crackled to life with another call. A concerned neighbor was reporting that an elderly woman hadn't been seen for several days. Her milk bottles were piling up outside her door, and no one was answering when people knocked. James listened to the details with the practiced attention of someone who had handled hundreds of similar situations, already mentally preparing for what he might find. Queen Camilla asked if she could accompany James to the call, understanding that this was highly irregular, but sensing an opportunity to witness firsthand how these situations unfolded. After quick consultations with security teams and senior officials, arrangements were made for the Queen Consort to observe from a distance as James responded to what might be another lonely person in need of help. The address was only a few miles from police headquarters. In a row of terraced houses that had seen better days, the neighborhood showed the familiar signs of urban decay mixed with gentrification. Some houses carefully restored with new windows and fresh paint, others showing neglect and abandonment. It was the kind of area where longtime residents watched their community change around them. sometimes feeling like strangers in places they had called home for decades. James approached number 47 with the careful awareness of someone who had learned that routine calls could quickly become complicated. The milk bottles were indeed piling up, 4 days' worth by his count, and the curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. He knocked firmly but gently, calling out his identification and explaining that neighbors were concerned. There was no response from inside, but James noticed that he could hear a television playing, the sound of a daytime quiz show filtering through the thin walls. From her position in the official vehicle, Queen Camilla watched as James worked through the protocols for welfare checks. He spoke with neighbors, gathering information about the resident, an 82-year-old woman named Dorothy Collins who had lived in the house for 40 years. The neighbors described her as quiet but friendly, someone who always said hello, but kept mostly to herself since her husband died 3 years earlier. She had no children, few visitors, and had become increasingly reclusive in recent months. The situation required careful handling. There was no evidence of immediate danger, but the accumulated milk and the lack of response suggested something was wrong. James made the decision to contact Dorothy's landlord for access to the property, but first he tried one more approach. He called out through the letter slot, identifying himself clearly and explaining that people were worried about her. This time, there was a response, a weak voice from somewhere inside asking who was there and what they wanted. The conversation that followed, conducted through a closed door, revealed another story of loneliness and fear. Dorothy had fallen 4 days earlier, not seriously injuring herself but shaking her confidence enough that she had become afraid to leave the house or even answer the door. She had been living on tea and biscuits, too embarrassed to call for help and too frightened to venture outside. The milk had accumulated because she couldn't face the prospect of opening the door to retrieve it, convinced that any interaction with the outside world might lead to criticism or judgment about her situation. James's approach was masterful in its patience and understanding. Rather than treating this as a simple welfare check to be resolved quickly, he recognized it as a complex situation involving pride, fear, and social isolation. He spent nearly an hour talking with Dorothy through the door, gradually building trust and helping her understand that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness or failure. He explained about local support services, about how many people in similar situations received assistance, about how her neighbor's concern came from kindness rather than judgment. Eventually, Dorothy agreed to open the door. She was a small woman with carefully styled grey hair and clothes that spoke of someone who still maintained her standards despite her circumstances. Her flat was immaculately clean but showed signs of someone who was struggling with daily tasks that had become more difficult with age. James's assessment revealed no immediate medical concerns, but he recognized that Dorothy, like Harold before her, was caught in a cycle of isolation that would only worsen without intervention. The process of connecting Dorothy with appropriate support services took most of the afternoon. James arranged for a social services assessment, contacted a local volunteer befriending scheme, and helped Dorothy understand how to access emergency assistance if she needed it in the future. But perhaps most importantly, he spent time simply talking with her, treating her as someone whose experiences and concerns mattered, whose dignity was worth preserving, even as she needed help. Queen Camilla observed this entire process with growing admiration for the complexity of modern community policing. This wasn't about enforcing laws or investigating crimes in any traditional sense. This was about recognizing that social problems often manifested as individual crises, that effective policing required understanding the broader context in which people lived their lives. James was functioning as much as a social worker and counselor as a police officer, roles that his training had prepared him for, but that went far beyond what most people expected from law enforcement. As they prepared to leave Dorothy Street, James reflected on how these calls had become an increasingly large part of his work. The demographic changes in British society meant that more and more elderly people were aging without traditional family support systems. Economic pressures had scattered families across the country and around the world, leaving older people isolated in communities where they might know few of their neighbors. The result was an epidemic of loneliness that often went unrecognized until it reached crisis proportions. James explained that the police had become, by default, the social service of last resort. When other systems failed or were unavailable, when families were absent or overwhelmed, when community connections had broken down, it was often a 999 call that represented someone's final attempt to reach out for help. This placed enormous responsibility on officers like him, who had to be ready to serve as counselors, advocates, mediators, and sometimes simply as proof that someone in the world cared whether a particular person lived or died. The drive back to police headquarters gave Queen Camilla time to process what she had witnessed. The two calls, Harold's desperate evening phone call and Dorothy's afternoon crisis, represented just a tiny fraction of the human dramas that played out every day across London. Behind the statistics about crime rates and response times were thousands of individual stories of people struggling with challenges that were often invisible to the broader society. What impressed her most was the dedication of the officers and operators who dealt with these situations. They could easily have processed Harold's call as a simple welfare check, dispatched an officer to verify he was safe, and moved on to the next emergency. Instead, they had recognized the deeper issues at play and had taken the time to address them comprehensively. The same was true of James's response to Dorothy's situation. He could have confirmed she was alive and uninjured and considered his duty fulfilled, but instead he had invested hours in ensuring she received appropriate ongoing support. This level of care and attention wasn't mandated by policy or procedure. It came from a deeper understanding of what public service meant, a recognition that their role was to serve the whole person rather than simply respond to immediate crises. It reflected a philosophy of policing that went beyond law enforcement to embrace community care and social responsibility. As they arrived back at headquarters, Queen Camilla found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she had witnessed. If these stories were representative of a larger pattern, then there were tens of thousands of people across the country who were struggling with isolation and abandonment. People whose problems were too complex for traditional emergency services, but too urgent to ignore. The question was how society could better address these challenges before they reached the point of crisis. The afternoon had revealed layers of social issues that she had never fully appreciated. The breakdown of community connections, the isolation of elderly people, the increasing complexity of navigating modern life for those who had grown up in simpler times. These were problems that affected millions of people, but often remained hidden until they exploded into emergency situations. James had mentioned that his colleagues handled similar calls almost daily, each one representing someone who had reached the end of their ability to cope alone. The cumulative emotional weight of these encounters was something the officers rarely talked about, but Queen Camilla could see it in their eyes, the way they carried the stories of people they had helped, and those they hadn't been able to reach in time. The evening following her visit to the Metropolitan Police headquarters found Queen Camilla in her private study at Clarence House, unable to shake the memories of the voices she had heard and the stories she had witnessed. The formal debriefing with her private secretary had covered the official aspects of the visit, the statistics about police modernization, the discussions about community partnerships, the photo opportunities that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers. But none of that captured what had really happened during those transformative hours in East London. She found herself thinking particularly about Harold Thompson, the 78-year-old man whose desperate 999 call had started everything. His voice had carried such profound vulnerability, such careful politeness even in the midst of crisis. The way he had repeatedly apologized for bothering the emergency services revealed something heartbreaking about how some people had learned to minimize their own needs, to see their struggles as burdens rather than legitimate calls for help. Queen Camilla had asked James Morrison to provide an update on Harold's situation, and the news had been encouraging. The community support services had been working well. Margaret had returned home from the hospital, and Harold had even attended his first meeting at the local seniors centre. But James had also mentioned something that stayed with her. Harold surprised that anyone had followed up on his situation at all. He had expected his call to be forgotten as soon as it ended, another anonymous voice in the constant stream of emergency communications. This assumption of disposability, of being forgettable in a world too busy to care about individual suffering, seemed to Queen Camilla to be at the heart of the social isolation that was affecting so many people. It wasn't just about practical support or emergency services. It was about the fundamental human need to matter, to be seen and acknowledged, to know that one's existence had meaning in a broader tapestry of community life. The more she reflected on the day's experiences, the more she understood that what she had witnessed represented a much larger crisis hiding in plain sight. The formal royal briefing she received regularly contained statistics about aging populations, healthcare pressures, and social services budgets, but they rarely conveyed the human reality of what those numbers actually meant. Behind every statistic about elderly isolation or emergency service calls were individual people struggling with circumstances that had overwhelmed their ability to cope. Over the following days, Queen Camilla found herself returning again and again to thoughts about Harold and Dorothy and the thousands of others like them. She began to research the broader context of what she had witnessed, discovering that social isolation among elderly people had been identified as a growing public health crisis equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, In terms of its impact on physical and mental well-being, the statistics were staggering. Millions of people in Britain reported feeling chronically lonely, with elderly people being particularly vulnerable to the health consequences of social disconnection. But what troubled her most was the realization that these problems were largely invisible to those who weren't directly affected by them. The elderly people who called 999 in desperation, who struggled with daily tasks that had once been routine, who went days without meaningful human contact, they were hidden in plain sight, living parallel lives in the same communities where other people went about their business unaware of the quiet suffering taking place behind closed doors. 3 weeks after her visit to the police headquarters, Queen Camilla made an unexpected decision. She asked her private office to arrange a return visit to East London, not for another official engagement, but to personally follow up on the cases she had encountered. This was highly unusual. Royal schedules were typically planned months in advance, and personal follow-up visits were not part of standard protocol. But something about those voices she had heard had created a sense of personal responsibility that she couldn't ignore. The return visit was arranged quietly, with minimal media attention and a small security detail. Queen Camilla's first stop was Harold Thompson's council flat, where she found a man transformed by the support network that had developed around him since his crisis call. Margaret was home and recovering well. But more importantly, Harold himself seemed to have found a new sense of purpose and connection. Harold was initially overwhelmed by the unprecedented visit, struggling to understand why someone of Queen Camilla's position would want to visit his modest home. But as they talked, his natural dignity and intelligence emerged. He spoke about his military service, about the decades he had worked in construction, about the community that had existed in his neighborhood when he and Margaret first moved there. He described how the area had changed over the years, how the informal networks of neighbors looking out for each other had gradually disappeared as people became more mobile and more isolated. What struck Queen Camilla most was Harold's insight into his own situation. He understood that his crisis hadn't really been about practical difficulties like cooking or laundry. Those were skills he could have learned if necessary. The real crisis had been about losing his sense of place in the world, about feeling disconnected from the community he had been part of for so many years. The 999 call had been less about emergency assistance and more about reaching out for proof that he wasn't completely alone. Margaret, despite her recent health struggles, had become an advocate for other elderly people facing similar challenges. She and Harold had connected with several neighbors who were dealing with their own versions of isolation and difficulty. Together, they had started an informal support network that met weekly in the community center, sharing resources and simply providing companionship for people who might otherwise go days without meaningful social interaction. The visit to Dorothy Collins revealed another kind of transformation. The shy, fearful woman who had been afraid to answer her door had become involved with a local volunteer organization that paired younger people with elderly residents for regular visits and practical support. Dorothy had discovered that her decades of experience as a seamstress were valued by young people who wanted to learn traditional skills, and she had begun teaching sewing classes at the community center. But perhaps most significantly, Dorothy had become something of an informal advocate for other elderly people in her area who were struggling with similar challenges. Her experience of being found by community policing had made her sensitive to signs of isolation in her neighbors. She had personally reached out to several people who seemed to be withdrawing from social contact, helping them connect with appropriate support before their situations reached crisis proportions. These individual transformations were encouraging, but Queen Camilla also learned about the broader systemic challenges that made stories like Harold's and Dorothy's increasingly common. Funding for community services had been under pressure for years, leaving gaps in support that often weren't identified until emergencies occurred. The traditional family structures that had provided care for elderly people were changing rapidly, with adult children often living far from aging parents and struggling to provide support from a distance. At the same time, Queen Camilla discovered inspiring examples of innovation and community response. Local organizations were developing new models of community care that combined professional services with volunteer support. Technology was being used to help isolated people maintain connections with family and community. Intergenerational programs were bringing together young people and elderly residents in mutually beneficial relationships. The police officers she met during her follow-up visit spoke about changes they had noticed in how these situations were being handled. The attention that Queen Camilla's initial visit had brought to community policing had resulted in additional resources and training for officers dealing with welfare calls. More importantly, it had sparked conversations about the broader role of law enforcement in addressing social problems that manifested as individual crises. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency operator who had played Harold's original call, had been working with colleagues to develop better protocols for identifying callers who might need ongoing support rather than just immediate assistance. They were exploring partnerships with social services and community organizations to ensure that people like Harold received comprehensive help rather than just crisis intervention. The impact extended beyond individual cases. Queen Camilla's experience had prompted discussions at the highest levels of government about the social isolation crisis and the need for coordinated responses that went beyond traditional emergency services. Policymakers were beginning to understand that addressing loneliness and isolation wasn't just a matter of social welfare. It was a public health priority that affected healthcare costs, emergency service demands, and community stability. But perhaps the most significant change was in Queen Camilla herself. The experience had fundamentally altered her understanding of what royal service could mean in the 21st century. The traditional model of royal engagements, ceremonial visits, ribbon cuttings, formal receptions, suddenly seemed inadequate to address the real challenges facing ordinary people. She began to envision a more direct and personal form of public service, one that focused on understanding and highlighting the human stories behind social problems. In the months that followed, Queen Camilla's public engagements began to reflect this new understanding. She sought out opportunities to meet with people facing challenges similar to those she had encountered during her police visit. She used her platform to draw attention to the work of community organizations addressing social isolation. Most importantly, she continued to follow up personally on the situation she encountered, maintaining the kind of ongoing connection that had been so meaningful to Harold and Dorothy. The ripple effects continued to expand. Media coverage of Queen Camilla's follow-up visits had sparked broader public conversation about elderly isolation and community responsibility. Local organizations reported increased volunteer applications and donation offers. Politicians found themselves pressed to address policy gaps that had been highlighted by the royal attention to these issues. Harold Thompson and Dorothy Collins had become quite unexpectedly symbols of a larger social challenge and examples of how individual connections could spark broader change. Their stories had travelled far beyond their East London neighbourhood, inspiring similar community initiatives across the country. Harold, in particular, had embraced his unexpected role as an advocate, speaking at conferences about ageing in place and community support systems. 1 year after that transformative 999 call, Queen Camilla returned once more to the Metropolitan Police headquarters. This time, the visit was planned as an opportunity to assess the changes that had resulted from her initial experience there. The Emergency Response Centre had implemented new protocols for identifying callers who might benefit from ongoing community support. Training programs had been expanded to help officers better understand the social context of welfare calls. Perhaps most significantly, partnerships had been developed with community organisations to ensure that people in crisis received comprehensive assistance. Sarah Mitchell, who had become something of a local celebrity for her role in the original incident, had been promoted to help train other emergency operators in recognising the deeper needs behind routine calls. She still worked regular shifts, but she also spent time teaching colleagues about the importance of listening not just to what callers said, but to what their situations revealed about broader social challenges. The visit concluded with Queen Camilla participating in a community event that Harold and Margaret Thompson had organised in their neighbourhood. Dozens of elderly residents attended, along with younger volunteers, local officials, and police officers. It was exactly the kind of intergenerational community gathering that had once been common, but had become increasingly rare in modern urban life. As she looked around the room at the connections that had developed from a single desperate phone call, Queen Camilla reflected on how unexpected encounters could sometimes reveal the most important truths about the society we live in. Harold's voice, shaking with fear and loneliness, as he called 999 on that autumn evening, had opened a window into challenges that affected millions of people, but often remained hidden from public view. The experience had taught her that the most meaningful public service often happened not in formal ceremonies or official engagements, but in the quiet moments of human connection, when people felt seen and valued for who they were. The transformation she had witnessed in Harold, Dorothy, and the many others whose stories had emerged from that initial visit demonstrated the power of simply paying attention, of treating individual struggles as worthy of care and response. Standing in that community centre, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of one elderly man's cry for help, Queen Camilla understood that she had discovered something profound about the nature of service and leadership in the modern world. Real change happened not through grand gestures or policy pronouncements, but through the accumulation of individual moments of compassion and connection. The 1999 call that had started everything was now part of training materials used across the emergency services. an example of how routine procedures could be transformed by recognizing the humanity behind every request for help. Harold's voice would continue to be heard by new generations of operators and officers, a reminder that behind every call was a person deserving of dignity, respect, and genuine care. For Queen Camilla, that voice had become a constant presence, a reminder of her responsibility not just to perform royal duties, but to use her position to shine light on the hidden struggles of ordinary people. The heartfelt 999 call had changed her understanding of what it meant to serve, and its echoes would continue to influence her work for years to come.